Perfect. It's recording. Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing very, very well. If you're watching this on YouTube or online, welcome. That's going to be the majority of you. And then also, of course, welcome to the people who are watching live. It's always nice to have people watching live. I enjoy it. And it's been nice to see consistently, little by little, more and more people have been watching live, which is really, really cool. So this is our session number 5 on teaching foreign languages. And today our topic is going to be on selecting learning outcomes when you are teaching a foreign language class, whether it be in a classroom setting within a school board, or if it's in a private, more of like a private language school situation. Regardless of which way it goes, it's important to have learning outcomes for the students. So our plan for today, we're going to go through 3 different steps to selecting outcomes. We're going to go through some examples of outcomes, of learning outcomes. That portion will be recorded. And then, of course, as usual, our Q&A and discussion portion will not be recorded. So if you are watching the recorded version of this and you would like to join the live versions of this, this takes place Tuesdays at 8:30 to 9:30 p.m. That is Mountain Standard Time. That's the time zone we use in Calgary, Alberta. That's in Canada. I'll put a link, depending on what platform you're watching this on. I'll make sure there's a link you can find somewhere, whether it's in the description below or wherever it is. I'll make sure there's a link so that you are able to join us for the future if you would like to. I'll do a very fast about me. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I think the majority of you watching this and majority of people here already know me, but just in case you don't, I'm from Calgary. That's a city in Canada close to the Rocky Mountains. I love learning languages. I speak 5 myself: English, French, Spanish, Mandarin, English, French, Spanish, Mandarin, and Gujarati. Those are my 5 languages. I have been very interested in learning languages ever since I was a teenager. Often it ends up being for travel purposes. I'm a big, big traveler. Obviously not in the COVID world, but when things are normal, I'm a big, big traveler. I try to travel at least once a year. So I've been to 15 different countries across the planet and over 100 cities. I don't know exactly how many cities, but definitely over 100. And teaching is a big, big passion of mine. So my mom's a teacher. I've grown up in a teaching household. Basically my whole professional life has always been, a big part of it has always been teaching. So my first real job was running a window cleaning business, where a huge part of my job was training, working with new franchisees, coaching them, ongoing training with them. And nowadays, for the past 3.5, is that right? Sorry, this is now the 4th. This is the 4th year. So we're halfway through the 4th year of me running the Calgary Language Nerds. And we teach a variety of different languages, which is what we do. And so, yeah, these sessions here is a way for me to share some of the teaching practices that we use at the Calgary Language Nerds. All right, so let's talk about selecting outcomes. Let's talk about the 3 major steps. The first step is you have to review your notes from the rough level assessment. So for people who have not seen the previous session, in the previous session, we talked about how to do a level assessment, how to get an idea of what level the student or students have. We talked about a system to do so. So you're gonna have to review your notes, because that's going to be the basis of one of the key elements of selecting learning outcomes. The level that they have and the knowledge that they currently have and the abilities they currently have in the foreign language are going to heavily influence what the learning outcomes are. Someone who is a beginner is going to have very different learning outcomes than, for example, myself. So for instance, here's a great example. I speak French and Spanish very fluently, very, very fluently, similar to my English, similar. However, recently I've decided that in this summer, I'm going to be taking some French and Spanish classes myself, because I've realized that I'm slowly forgetting some things and slowly struggling with the language a little bit more than I used to. And while the average person from the outside may not notice it, I feel it. So you can imagine my learning outcomes, if I was taking a class, are going to be wildly different than an intermediate, beginner student, whatever the case is. So the second step, you're going to figure out the students short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals with the language. It's worth noting that this this might be different for kids and adults. It's worth noting that if you have a 6-year-old kid taking French classes, they're probably not thinking in short-term, medium-term, long-term goals. That's probably not in their mind. So that might not really be applicable in the same way. Versus an adult, of course, they probably have some concept in their mind as to what they're trying to work towards and why they're learning, what they'd like to accomplish. Usually they have some concept of what they're trying to achieve. So for adults, you need to have a conversation with the students, and even older teenagers, things like that. It's important to have an understanding. And for kids, it still matters, but it matters in a little bit of a different way. It matters more in terms of getting alignment, making sure you and the student are on the same page as to what you're trying to work towards. So slightly different, but kind of similar. And then lastly, we're going to choose some realistic and more importantly, maybe equally importantly, some measurable goals based on their level and what they're trying to work towards. So goal timelines. I mentioned, let's actually go back a step. I mentioned that it's important to understand the students' short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. The question will often become, how the heck do you know what short-term, medium-term, and long-term means? How do you figure that out? Because let's think about it. Let's say we have a 10-year-old who is taking, I don't know, Japanese for whatever reason, or Mandarin, or French, or Spanish, or whatever it is. They're taking a language, and let's say they're taking it, whether it's in school or in an after-school program, doesn't really matter. Long-term could be into adulthood. Long-term could be just that one school year. Long-term, how do we define what these mean? What is short-term? What is long-term? What is medium-term? Think about a student. I literally just had a student right now who took, 2 weeks of classes? Yeah, 2 weeks of classes because she just wanted to prep for this job interview. That is totally different. All of a sudden, her version of short-term, medium-term, long-term is wildly different than going back to that one child example who has X number of years ahead of him. So timelines are based on current level of performance. We're going to look at the next logical step for them to improve. So, and then we need to get buy-in on what that next logical step is. So it's important to think about as well, what end goal does a student have in mind? Why are they learning? What purpose do they have for learning? So that's also important to be thinking about. All of these are going to influence goal timelines. So I'll give you a couple of examples of I'll give you a couple of examples of how they might be different. So if we look at, for instance, let's say someone tells you that they want to retire to Colombia, and that's why they want to learn Spanish, and they're going to retire in about a year. That's when they're thinking of moving down to Colombia. All of a sudden, if they're moving in a year, right, we have essentially their long-term goal becomes 1 year. In fact, let's actually write this as we go. Let's just create a new slide. Why not? Let's just create one right now. We can get a visual here, right? Let's just delete this for a second. Right, so if someone is moving to Colombia in 1 year, right, all of a sudden the long-term goal immediately becomes 1 year. Right, that's kind of all long-term goals are going to work around that. That is our definition of long-term, right? Which therefore means that our medium-term goals probably end up being, let's say, every few months, let's say probably, medium term is probably something like 3 to 5 months ends up being like a medium term goal. We're going to have some goals around there. And then short term, we're probably going to have some monthly, maybe bi-monthly goals, right? Heck, we might even have weekly goals depending on it. We might, right? But probably every 1 to 2 months is going to be some short term goals that we work towards. Versus if someone told me, let's say they're not moving to Colombia in a year. Let's say they're like, you know what? I've always wanted to learn French, and I've just never gotten around to it. Again, this is assuming adults, because a child probably won't say that. But let's say they're like, man, I've always wanted to learn French. I live in Canada. I really want to have like a near native level of French. That's what I really want to have. Right now, I don't speak a word, right? So if they're doing near native level of French, now all of a sudden we've got some different timelines that we're working with. And now, you know, there's some extra nuances we should be aware of. Now the long-term goal might be, good Lord, who knows? We're gonna have like we need to almost add a category. We almost need to have like, we almost need like a super long-term, like what, 10 years? I don't know. Like, good Lord, near native level, how long does that take? I'm still working on, I just told you I'm gonna be taking classes soon. Right? So who knows what that is? That's a very, very long term away, super long term, right? Then maybe our long term is going to become, heck, we might say 1 year is long term, right? Who knows? So it's important to understand, what is the student actually thinking? What do they have in their mind in terms of what they're working towards? Again, I do want to stress this. Sometimes as I've been making these sessions here, I always forget to stress the importance of that there's differences for kids and adults. So I think for kids, one thing that would be incredibly different is that they're not really going to know what their goals are. Probably not really. You're probably going to have to be a little bit more directive on, okay, here's what we're trying to work on. Here's what we're trying to get to. Here's why. Can we do that? It's going to be a little bit different there. But still, even kids are going to need certain very measurable goals that everybody knows. The kid knows, you know, we all know what we're trying to work towards. Now, here's some examples of what goals you might have. So you might have, for example, able to listen and fully understand any audio at an A1 level. That might be a goal that you select, right? Able to give 3-sentence replies to any question asked. This is actually something I recently had with a student. I literally pulled this directly from one of my students' note files. She was reasonably strong in Spanish student? Yes, Spanish, reasonably strong in Spanish, but had some challenges with, like, she'll understand almost everything. Like, she's really good comprehension. But when she speaks, she only speaks in these like 1-sentence replies, 1-word replies, and she wouldn't give full replies. So we wanted to work on that. So we're like, okay, we have 2 months together. This is a 2-month course. You're taking some group classes. Let's really work together to try and get you to have 3-sentence replies every single time someone asks you a question. With the caveat of, you know the words that you would like to use. Like if someone asks you about something really complex that you've never studied, maybe you're going to struggle to give a reply because you're lacking some vocabulary. But if you're asked about something where you actually have the vocabulary to answer, we're going to answer in 3-sentence replies. Right, this one here, this is pulled from a French note file because asking questions in French is quite different and quite challenging in comparison to, for example, Spanish, let's say. It's a little bit more complex. So you're able to ask who, what, where, when, why, how, and how many questions. You're able to ask those questions using those words. Right, or another one here, correctly uses the present tense with regular verbs in oral speech. Right, or in speech, rather. You can't really have a speech, right? Oral speech or speech, I suppose. These are some examples of some goals that you might have. Notice these are all quite measurable. Notice they're measurable. They are very measurable and clear. Like, it's very clear what the goals are. Now, the last thing I'll say before we get to our questions and discussion here, which obviously that portion is not recorded, but the final thing I'll say on this is, and this is why I love the discussion portion. It's always one of my favorite parts. You know, I love hearing about different teaching scenarios. Everybody has a different, everyone teaches in a different capacity. Some people teach in a university or a college. Some people teach kindergarten. Some people teach in a private language school, which is more or less my world, right? It's kind of the world that I deal with the most directly. You know, some people have, there's a lot of different, some people might be only working private students. Some people might be working in large groups. Some people might be, there's a lot of different nuances that are important to understand. And so what we're going through in this PowerPoint here that we've gone through, right? I think there's some good general guidelines to look at, but I do think it's important for everybody to also think about what context are you teaching in? Are you in a school board? Are you in a private language school? Or are you teaching kids? Are you teaching adults? And it's important to kind of pick and choose the things that really apply to you most, because I can only speak from my experiences, and also I can only really speak at the most general of levels, because there's so many different ideas or so many different definitions, I suppose, of what teaching looks like. So I'm really excited to get into some of the discussion here. It's going to be really good. So we're going to jump into that. So the recorded portion will end here. People who watched recorded, thank you for your time. And then the non-recorded people, the live people, let's chat. All right, everyone. See you later.